2 days after the US President visited Israel and Saudi Arabia, Russian President Vladimir Putin made a rare visit abroad to Teheran, even as his Ukraine campaign drags on. Today, Russia is left with a few friends, and it's keen to win more. Therefore, Mr. Putin's visit to Tehran was aimed at strengthening ties with Iran that has been at the receiving end of US-led sanctions, like Russia, by drawing Tehran into an anti-US grouping along with China. On this visit abroad, Mr. Putin also engaged with Turkish President Mr. Erdogan, who could facilitate a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. Erdogan could also keep the opening of Black Sea route for export of Ukraine's large stocks of grains to Asia and Africa. And as the Europeans want to wean away from Russian oil and gas and in its place draw on oil and gas from the Gulf region, the major supplier to India and China, India could revert back to importing Iranian oil. To that extent, Tehran and New Delhi have recently reinitiated high-level diplomatic engagements.
We have two experts who are going to help us understand the various issues connected with the relationship with Iran. We have with us Ambassador Srivastava, who has been our envoy in Iran from 2011 to 2015, has seen many important twists and turns in the relationship and how Iran finally was put under a tough sanctions regime called the JCPOA. And we have Professor Harsh V Pant, eminent strategic affairs expert, vice president now of the ORF, and also professor at King's College London, who is a regular commentator in the media on a variety of geostrategic issues. So I'll start with you, Ambassador Srivastava, sir. My first question is linked to the disappointment in Iran with the fact that India has not lived up to many of the promises that have been made in the recent past, and these were perhaps cancelled because pressure was brought on New Delhi from Washington after the various initiatives that America has put into place to tighten the sanctions regime around Iran. India has a lot of catching up to do, I'm told, and these would require India to revisit the relationship where bilateral trade had dropped to over just $2 billion and could go back, if some of the right methodologies are used, to its earlier figure a decade ago of to about $17 billion. So your views on the need to catch up, sir?
India, as you mentioned, has historical ties which have been reinforced by geostrategic realities and the commercial relations. We have, at the government level, I don't represent the government, but I must say, at the government level, India has continued to engage with Iran on a variety of issues. This is reflected in repeat visits at high level from both sides. Our EM has and NSA have visited Iran, and we have had the visit of Admiral Shamkhani, the Iranian NSA, last year, and very recently the Iranian foreign minister. The issue which you pointed out relates to decisions by the private sector. These are commercial decisions about purchase of oil, and the government does not directly interfere, but sanctions do have an effect on some of these decisions taken by these companies. And as a result, the two-way trade has come down. During my time, the trade was more than $14 billion. But since then, it has come down. We hope it will pick up again once a more conducive atmosphere is created, and this includes revival of JCPOA, which India supports.
Okay, so, and you have actually seen some of the JCPOA paperwork being done in your time just before you departed from Iran, as you mentioned to me before the show, and Professor Harsh V Pant. Now, the JCPOA is really the big stone around everybody's neck. The Americans have been talking about somehow allowing Iran to extricate itself from the knots that have been tied around Iran. At the same time, Iran has been proactive with its diplomacy also, stating that you allow us to get out of it, and our massive reserves of oil can help address some of the requirements in Europe after the Ukrainian war. And this will be beneficial to us because the Europeans are otherwise going to eat into India's requirements that are filled from the Gulf countries. Your view?
Maruf, I think, the JCPOA story, as you know, and Ambassador Srivastava would know, has been going back and forth for a very long time. Now, the reality is that the Biden administration came to office promising big things, and including JCPOA. We have not seen any results so far, and I think there is genuine frustration now in Tehran also about it. But also what you see is a recalibration happening in Washington. Washington is reaching out to Saudi Arabia. Biden's big visit to the Middle East this month itself. So I think there are the larger forces that are now shaping the geostrategic environment in the Middle East, perhaps are moving in the opposite direction to what Biden had promised. We are not looking at Iran's integration much as we are looking at more and more isolation of Iran. If you combine the Israelis and the Arab Gulf states in terms of the dynamic that are evolving, and if Biden is really able to now mend fence with the Saudis, I think that's going to be a dramatic recalibration after the whole Khashoggi incident and the isolation of MBS in the Western world. We are looking at his gradually he's being pushed back or pulled into the Western orbit once again. And we have also seen the larger context of where the Middle Eastern geostrategic evolution has happened, including the post-Abraham Accords, a lot of convergence between Israelis and the Arab Gulf states, and of course the famous quad that is also, I think, will have its second meeting this month, which involves UAE, India, Israel, and the Americans. So I think there is therefore genuine concern, perhaps in Iran, that things have not moved so far. And what it tells us is that the post, at the end of this month, at the end of this year, when you will have American midterms, which Democrats are expected to lose, and Biden is expected to lose significant political capital. Yeah. His ability to shape the diplomatic agenda, especially JCPOA, gets even more scared. So the question about JCPOA is that it has not given anything substantive to Iranians so far, and therefore the Iranian gravitation also towards China and Russia is increasing.
Very well put. In fact, you led me on to the next question I had in mind for you, but I'll come back to you on one of the other connected issues. And Ambassador Srivastava, sir, the one area that Iran is witnessing more and more Indian enthusiasm in, and a further commitment after this 2 years of a hiccup, is rebuilding of the various platforms of the Chabahar port, the Shahid Bahishti terminal and others, which were left undone earlier. And the Chabahar port, as you know only too well, was really the stepping stone for the countries north of Iran, Central Asia and Russia to put products out into the Arabian Sea, and for India to reach out to Iran and from there into Afghanistan and Central Asia. Your view, sir.
You are right. There is a conscious attempt from both sides to pick up the thread and quickly move on with building of Chabahar port. Chabahar was originally conceived as a gateway to Afghanistan, and that rationale still stands. It is also part of INSTC, but INSTC had a larger purpose, which was to cut short the freight time for trade with Central Asian republics and Russia. Now, INSTC has many legs. It starts from Bandar Abbas port in the Hormuz Strait, and it connects to 5 points on Iran's northern border, ranging from Caspian Sea ports like Crossing, which is Inche Baroun and Sarikh. Now, where does Chabahar fit in? Chabahar's importance to Iran lies in the fact that this is the only port outside the Hormuz Strait. Its importance for us is that it cuts short our sailing time to Bandar Abbas by half. There is no waiting time there. So this can be an ideal link both for Afghanistan as well as for reaching out to Central Asian republics.
Okay, so that's very, very precise. And I am sure these are the points that people following this issue will pick on the map to understand exactly the significance of Chabahar. But after a break, we will look at what are Iran's ambitions to re-emerge into the geostrategic equation with or without the JCPOA. Welcome back. We are continuing to look at India's relations with Iran, a very important geostrategic neighbor of India, pushed into the corner by earlier American regimes who are insisting that Iran must be weakened to a point that it abandons its nuclear program. But that's the subject of another debate. But briefly put, Professor Harsh V Pant, one is what really would be the motivator for the international community to let go of the sanctions on Iran, allowing Iran to get back into the play, failing which, as you mentioned in your earlier response, Iran is quite clearly looking at enhancing its strategic network with China and Russia, having signed a 25-year arrangement with China for supplying oil for other benefits. I think trading with Russia and becoming part of the IRC could next be the Iranian strategic agenda with or without the blessings of the West. Your view?
Yes, Maruf, it seems that, the West has always, underappreciated the role and the importance of Iran in the strategic calculus, or not only in the region, but also beyond. Like for India, Iran is such an important partner in multiple ways. So for India, it's a no-brainer that we have to engage Iran with or without American blessings, or with or without American Western support. Now, what I think the idea has always been is to push Iran, to isolate Iran, to marginalize Iran in the Middle East because of America's traditional partnerships in the region. There was a brief hope that under Obama, when JCPOA happened, that perhaps a rapprochement has started with Iran. But there are such strong, constituencies within the US and in certain parts of the Western world that do not see Iran, that continue to see Iran as a challenger. And the moment Biden administration talked about reviving JCPOA, almost all the partners of America in the Middle East started campaigning against it, and Israelis were front and center. You also had the Saudis and the UAE that took on a position. Now, I think for America and for the West today, and perhaps for Iran, something is there in the Russian question that Iran can reasonably argue that, look, Iran can be a source of oil and gas for a large part of the world, can ease the burden on the global oil market, energy markets, if Iran is treated properly. But unfortunately, that is not happening. And unfortunately, we are not seeing that motivation still front and center. Europeans have made a case, but Americans are not listening at this point. So it looks as if we are continuing to move in that direction. And therefore, China has upped the ante. China is again, as you were saying, not only a big deal with Iran, where China is present in a big way, but also now talking of bringing Iran into BRICS, and expanding BRICS and other such platforms. And therefore, I think, and for India, I think that is going to be a very, very interesting question to tackle. Essentially, what what Iran brings to the table and how that the BRICS can be engaged with. But I think the larger question that the Western world will have to answer is: are they really looking at a situation where Iran becomes the primary benefactor, a primary player with the Russians and the Chinese in the Middle East? Or are they looking at Middle East through the Cold War prism of blocks? So you have these divisions, Middle East getting divided into these blocks, where you have the Arab Gulf states, Israel on the one side and Iran on the other. And that's not good news for India, because India has traditionally relied on all three constituents being an important part of its West Asia and Middle Eastern policy.
Yeah, very well put. I mean, it's a lesson in geostrategy that you've just given to all of us. But really, the games that are being played need to be understood at the level that they're being played. And one of the things is the Chinese have been defiant, and they have engaged with Iran, bought their oil, sanctions or no sanctions. And this has allowed Iran to continue to remain afloat, just like the Chinese are buying a lot of Russian oil now, despite the sanctions and the Ukraine war. But Ambassador Srivastava, back to you to a specific question where we need you to educate us. And that is the International North-South Transport Corridor, INSTC, as you mentioned in your earlier response, was meant to cut down travel and transportation time. And we have at least one instance now of a consignment that has come from St. Petersburg to India, and what would have taken close to 40 days plus has come in 15 days shorter than that. So therefore, it is really a time saver. And it is also something that would allow south to north movement, just like north to south movement of goods, because Central Asia, where we have a lot of goodwill, is also keen to get Indian goods and engage with India. Your view on the INSTC?
INSTC, I would call it International North-South Transit Corridor. Now, it has two legs. Let's take up Central Asia first. Central Asia has a global import basket of more than $67 billion. India's share in this is tiny, which is about $2 to $3 billion of Indian exports. The reason is absence of connectivity, and this is the gap which INSTC can bridge. Now, the second aspect is trade with Russia, and as you pointed out, it cuts short the transit time. Now, that has the other aspect. An exporter or importer does not have to block his money for a longer period. So there is a saving in terms of interest incurred. Now, I would, in a sense, INSTC is India's is BRICS counterpart, which India can support and exploit to mutual benefit with all countries of the region.
Okay, thank you. Very clear that it is something that we cannot let go of, regardless of the kind of pressures that Washington puts on us. And Professor Harsh V Pant, the last question to you, and that is that, you see, the Iranians are very keen to get back into the geostrategic discourse, regardless of the restrictions put on them. And an example of that is that they had recently joined the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and now they've made a bid for BRICS. And BRICS is clearly read by countries that are not in America's good books, Russia and China. India is also there, but India, as you wrote recently in one of your pieces, is one country that has shown enormous capacity to be engaging with all groups, regardless of which side they are, at least on the Ukrainian issue. But Iran going in there into BRICS will clearly align Iran against the American-led Western bloc. So do we see a rising of tensions, or do we see this second coming out party for Iran?
See, I think the Western world is not giving Iran much of a space if the Western world was smarter, and if the Americans in particular, they would be moving forward with much greater alacrity on JCPOA, so that in order to bring Iran on board. But the sense that Iran is left in the lurch is a sense that Iranians are actually very uncomfortable with, and there is a genuine desire. And as you say, Iran views itself as a civilizational power in the region, and not in the region in terms of in a large part of the world. They view themselves very ambitiously. They may not have the capabilities, but that doesn't mean that you can you have no right to have a broader strategic ambition. So I think moving into the ambit of the Chinese and the Russians gives them, they can ride on the coattails of the Chinese and create a room for them to maneuver, if only to tell the Americans that, look, maybe you need to hurry up on JCPOA. Maybe this will give a signal. But my point is that domestically, the capacity of Biden is weakening so dramatically that he would not have that space, even if tomorrow, BRICS admit Iranians. You can imagine in 2023, a weakened Biden not being able to push through JCPOA or any rapprochement with Iran. And I think that's the dilemma that America faces at this point, which is much of its own creation. But I think for Iran, certainly this is an opportunity, and I would I would think that they would use that very carefully. And for India, therefore, there is going to be essentially a question: if BRICS becomes a platform of countries that are only anti-Western in their orientation, then what does India do, and how does India balance it out with its other interlocutors? But I think that's for another time. But I think Iran's entry into BRICS certainly will change the equations dramatically.
Yes, thank you very much. And I've always argued that, after Ukraine, what people haven't really deliberated much about is this great opportunity for India to emerge as a swing state. So we can play the game as it suits us without upsetting anybody. And one of the examples is that we've been talking to Iran again of doing trade in rupee and Iranian currency, which keeps us outside the sanction regime. But all that for another day. Thank you very much for your wisdom and your insights. And I'm sure those who watch it will realize that there are opportunities even when the clouds are dark, and that must be exploited. Thanks for watching. Until our next episode, goodbye.